Okay.
How you doing? You're all very, very welcome tonight to Tras na Tíre, the place where you don't let things like a virus get in the way of us remembering our Irish history. My name is Marcus Howard of Easter Rising Stories, and I'm your host this evening. And tonight we have an excellent talk combining two wonderful topics: alcohol and the Irish War of Independence. Tonight we're looking at different kinds of shots, different kind of rounds altogether. The pub itself was its very own unique weapon in the Irish War of Independence. And our speaker tonight is somebody very special. We have Eddie Bohan, who's going to be tracing how the pub was a meeting place, a safe house, and a banker during this period. Eddie Bohan in 2011 began the original 1916 Easter Rising coach tour. I was on it twice, and I visited all the major battle sites of the Rising, and it continues today. It was the tour to be on in 2016. I'm telling you that now, it really was. He currently runs the Irish Broadcasting Hall of Fame, and he's a regular contributor to the Ireland's own magazine. Feel free to put any questions or comments in the Q&A. Like I say, I just showed you this as well. He also has written a book called Thirst for Freedom, the topic tonight. It's available at www.kilmainhamtales.ie. So consider tonight, of all nights, your own virtual bar for this evening. Pull up a chair, crack open your favorite drink, relax, and as they say in the film The Quiet Man, well, it's a nice soft night, so I think I'll go and join me comrades and talk a little treason. Eddie, you're very welcome.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Fair play to you. And thanks to Liam and Tras na Tíre for probably educating, entertaining, and enthralling us over the last year. I thoroughly enjoyed some of the nights, some of the lectures. I've put this book together for two particular reasons, and again, my two loves, which is Irish history and the fact that I have for 40 years been a barman. Most recently, until the pubs closed, I was the day manager in the Stag's Head. I'd like to start by just sort of dedicating this talk to two sections of people. Firstly, those in the hospitality industry who have spent the last year gardening, homeschooling, cooking, cleaning, and not pulling pints and serving us great food. And I also want to pay tribute to those in the hospitality industry, and I know a good few who have succumbed to COVID over the past year. And thanks to those who have turned up and not watching the match, although probably some of you have a sneaky screen on the side watching it. The British Crown maintained its rule over Ireland for centuries through a combination of better trained forces, equipment, and an intelligence system often based on paid informers. The Irish rose up many times, from the failure of 1798 to subsequent rebellions of Emmet in 1803, the Young Islanders in 1848 and the Fenians in 1867, right up to the volunteer-led 1916 Rising. The bravery and enthusiasm of those rebels was not enough to defeat the British. Ireland did, however, possess one vital weapon that the British did not. And as the first shots of the War of Independence rang out, the rebels had perfected its use with deadly consequences. Some of those 10,000 secret weapons fell into enemy hands. Some remained neutral, but the vast majority were in Irish nationalist hands. And without them, we would not be the free, independent state we are today. That weapon was the public house. Without the public house, I maintain that Ireland could still easily be part of the British Empire today. My book, Thirst for Freedom, tells the story of the pivotal role of alcohol in the creation of the state. I'm not going to recant the whole book here, but I'm going to pick out a few points that leads the way towards the conclusion of that Ireland could still be in the empire. The pub has and continues to occupy an important role in Irish social and political history. It has been resilient in the face of war, rebellion, famine, recession, and of course now pandemics. It has survived temperance movements, boycotts, and violent destruction. Their numbers have fallen dramatically since the foundation of the state, from 17,142 licensed in 1860 to 7,193 in 2017. At times, the pub and the consumption of alcohol has received negative publicity, but yet they have maintained their importance on the front line of Irish history. Throughout the centuries, publicans have acted as justices of the peace, and the premises have been used as venues for inquests before the advent of coroners' courts. Even criminal court trials could be held in a pub when no other premises was available. The pubs, breweries, and distilleries became battlegrounds, but like many battles and wars, The casualties were often the ordinary customers, who found themselves visiting their local with fatal consequences. Ireland's revolutionary stories have been portrayed by the British media as drunken Irish riots. This was to both diminish the seriousness and the impact of these uprisings. Alcohol itself has been at the heart of many global revolutions, including the American Whiskey War and the 18th century French Revolution. In the aftermath of the 1798 rebellion here in Ireland and its crushing, one commentator remarked, "Our people lay drunk in the ditches and the troops obtained an easy victory. We would learn from those mistakes." By allowing the pubs to stay open, even at the height of rebellion, the British believed that a drunken rebellion would be easier to quell. In fact, one of the few countries in the British Empire where Britain declared martial law during the 1916 Rising, they actually allowed certain pubs to open, again, believing that they could get the rebels drunk and then quash the rebellion quicker. For the British Exchequer, the Irish pub generated millions of pounds, which often found its way to financing multiple overseas military operations. It is not a coincidence that during periods of heightened tensions on this island, the sales of products like Guinness and Irish whiskey increased significantly. At a meeting in Limerick in 1895, Michael Davitt, the Langley founder, suggested that patriotic Irishmen should boycott all public houses to prevent the 5.5 million in annual drink taxes being contributed to the British Exchequer. That's in 1885. Under the pressures of a revolution, the public house was a social escape. You may not be able to trust your neighbour, but you knew which pub to drink in, and you knew which one was safe. Some pubs played host to like-minded individuals who were fermenting rebellion. This was the social gathering, which often appeared innocent, but they moved into snugs and back rooms where plans were hatched and secret councils of war had power over life and death. This snug here is the one perhaps some of you might recognise as Toners. And the reason I use that is the very first pub I worked in. Fado. Spent 10 wonderful years in Toners. The pub was a place to gain information on and from the enemy, with both sides enjoying a drink, thus creating loose lips. The customer often doubled as the informer, which in itself was quite a lucrative occupation in straitened financial times. Sometimes false information was delivered and testimony given under oath simply to access enemy cash. Misinformation frequently led to miscarriages of justice and summary executions. For the British, they realised that information gained in the public house was invaluable to stopping attacks or even preempting a revolution. Pubs were used by revolutionaries to swear in members and to test allegiances. Loyalties could be identified by the pub you drank in. The pub explained much about your background. You could be identified as being pro-nationalist or unionist, pro-British or Irish, rich or poor, Protestant or Catholic, armed or unarmed, and most importantly, friend or foe. The pub building itself could be used to launch an ambush on a passing patrol, and in many villages and towns, the barracks or police station was conveniently located next door to a public house. The pub cellar was an ideal hiding place for weapons. This invaluable arsenal was often accessed by stealing them from drunken soldiers or buying them from the enemy, desperate to earn extra revenue. According to Joseph O'Rourke's witness statement, many of these military deals were arranged by members of the Grocers and Vintners Assistance Association, basically the Barmen's Union. Notably, one source was a barman named Walsh in Mooney's pub of Parnell Street. Another source, he said, was Dunn from Mulnahack, who arranged deals in the Brazen Head. Jimmy McNamara also worked in Mooney's in Parnell Street and was very active during the War of Independence and was tried in the aftermath of Bloody Sunday with the murder of Captain Bagali, but was found not guilty. Security forces proved to be creatures of habit. Therefore, as they sat in a pub or as they left, they proved themselves to be soft targets for the IRA. Alcohol would diminish their ability to fight back and react quickly to save their lives. However, alcohol also heightened their sense of revenge, and drink-induced retaliations often greatly outweighed the original attack. The pub acted as the rebellion bank. A sympathetic publican would collect and maintain rebel funds. He was a trusted businessman within the community. He was the man who would be there for christenings, marriages, and funerals, once described as the man who would hatch him, match him, and dispatch him. As a cash business, the pub was often robbed and looted. It became an economic target, with boycotts. It was also a sectarian target, depending on its location. The pub had multiple uses, each one important in tackling the enemy. Prior to the arrival of the telephone, the publican, or his employee, was the conduit whereby secret messages were sent and delivered. The pub was used as a safe house for on-the-run rebels to lay low. Many publicans avoided any overt involvement in illegal activities to remain above suspicion in order to provide these safe hideouts. Of course, an important component of any pub is the beer and spirits. And while it was often looted during attacks, it also provided Dutch courage for the young men who, with very little training, were facing life and death dilemmas. Occasionally, whiskey was used as a medicine to treat a wounded man, to cauterize wounds, or to act as an anesthetic. The spirits even looked after those in charge, with personal supplies of whiskey scattered around various friendly pubs. You need only to read of the stories of Michael Collins's bottles of whiskies available in pubs that he frequented, often under the very noses of the British authorities. Again, if you're out and about around town, there are many pubs that you can visit and places of interest you can visit around the city that would have connections with revolution, like the Lord Edward, named after Lord Edward Fitzgerald, and Sweetman's on the Quays. We'll come to Sweetman's later on. In 1826, a British soldier wrote in the Devizes and Wiltshire Gazette, speaking of the events in New Ross in the 1798 rebellion. He said, "The rebels advanced upon New Ross at daybreak and soon made themselves master of it. The conflict was bloody but short in duration. Instead, however, in taking advantage of their success, they supplied themselves with whiskey. They soon became an irregular and riotous mob. This state of things soon reached the ears of the regular troops, who re-entered the town with little or no resistance and massacred the unfortunate wretches." The newspapers of the day reported that the British militia had marched into Gorey, led by a man called Hunter Gowan, who, following an earlier battle, brandished his sword in the air as he marched through the town with a human finger attached. He and his men stormed a public house in the town and drank to their heart's content, using the severed finger to stir their drinks. On May 28, 1798, a British militia led by Edward Turner entered the small village in Wexford of Balnamonabeg and arrived at Jeremiah Kavanagh's public house. He was known as Darby Kavanagh. Kavanagh was a United Irishman, and with military experience, having served under George Washington in the US War of Independence. The rebels, almost 2,000 of them, led by Edward Fitzgerald, Edward Roach, and Philip Roach, had gathered outside Kavanagh's pub. After some hours, and with rumours of an advancing British army, the rebels began to disappear. But the leaders, with the exception of Fitzgerald, stayed in the pub conducting a council of war. With the arrival of the British, the rebels fled. Turner and his men entered the pub and helped themselves to all the beer and whiskey they could, claiming they were much fatigued after their hasty march through the heavy sandy roads. Having drank the pub dry of its contents, they burnt it down. This is the burial place of Jeremiah Kavanagh in Balnamonabeg. In 1803, Emmet planned his rebellion. 80 rebels spent a number of hours in the Golden Bull Inn and were extremely drunk when the command to go out onto the streets to rebel was issued. The Thomas Street area was also laden with distilleries, and they were raided and their contents looted. The rebellion quickly degenerated into a drunken riot and was easily crushed. With Robert Emmet, who had conducted much of the planning of the rising in the Brazen Head, facing the hangman on Thomas Street on September 20th, 1803. His executioner, Thomas Galvin, ironically also was a well-known customer of the Brazen Head, where much of the rebellion had been planned. One of the sadder cases of that period was that of John Doyle. He ran a pub on Plunkett Street. Plunkett Street no longer exists. It was located between Patrick Street and Francis Street. He participated in the 1803 rebellion, meeting up with the rebels on Thomas Street just around the corner from his pub. Doyle was arrested and sentenced to 7 years transportation to Van Diemen's Land. As his prison ship departed the River Liffey, left behind in Dublin was his pregnant wife and 3 children, including his oldest son, 16-year-old John Jr. The bond between father and son was close, and 18 months after his father had gone, the son willfully stabbed a man on Dame Street with the sole intention of being transported like his father to Van Diemen's Land, where the two would be reunited. But John Jr.'s transportation took him to the Australian mainland, and while his father served out his sentence and eventually returned to Ireland, John Jr. died as a result of a prison brawl in 1828, never returning to see his father. And it wasn't, of course, the pubs. It was breweries, brewery workers. It was drink was at the heart of it. This is Sweetman's Brewery. At one time, it was second in production to Guinness of all beer in Dublin. In 1798, their main brewery was along the River Liffey, basically where Poolbeg and Hawkins Street is now, and where you can go to J.W. Sweetman's today on the Quays. But their headquarters was located on Francis Street, and it was the venue for many secret United Irishmen meetings. John Sweetman, the then owner of the Sweetman Brewery, was greatly beloved and trusted by the United Irishmen. He had assisted in the escape of Hamilton Rowan to France, but in 1798, Sweetman was arrested in Oliver Bond's house after informers, including the infamous Bell Martin, linked him to seditious activities. He was incarcerated in Kilmainham Jail before being sent to Fort George in Scotland, and then later deported to the continent in 1802. Throughout the 19th century, the public house was a focal point for agitation, agrarian violence and illegal organisations such as the Fenians, Young Islanders, White Boys and the Ribbon Men. Vendettas were settled, and small local conflicts, often exaggerated through alcohol, made the public house a very unsafe way of socialising. In 1848, the Young Islanders planned a new rising, but as history tells us, it failed in the cabbage patch of Widow McCormick's. The night before, according to a trial witness in the aftermath of the rebellion, 3 jaunting cars pulled up outside Thomas Sullivan's public house, now Maisie Dunn's, at Commons near Ballingarry. Some of Ireland's most distinguished patriots at the time met on the evening of July 28 to determine a course of action for the Irish Confederation. A council of war took place. As other rebels left, William Smith O'Brien, James Stephens, Terence Bellew McManus and Patrick O'Donoghue remained to prepare for a rising. This was a meeting of the Provisional Government of the Irish Republic, and it had taken place in a public house. One of the Young Islanders arrested in the aftermath of the rising was Thomas Francis Marr, the man credited with the Irish tricolour. Coincidentally, he was a cousin and a namesake of a man who owned the Lombard pub on Pearse Street, as it is today. And during the 1916 rising, Maher was using the pub to store weapons in its cellar for the rebels, and it was used as a staging post to attack the telephone cables that passed outside the pub, connecting it to Western Row Station. More about 1916 and on. The Fenian Rebellion of 1867 extensively used pubs in Dublin to carry out its illegal activities. John Devoy, in his book Recollections of a Rebel, states, we selected pubs owned or managed by friends and changed them regularly. But, he added, our men were the soberest lot of soldiers I ever saw. The 1867 leadership failed to take into account, however, how easy it was for the British to bribe fellow Irishmen with the promise of drink to become early supergrasses. The British intelligence agents knew of these pubs and were able to infiltrate them with spies and informers. The informers were plentiful once plied with porter and whiskey. One of the most famous pubs involved in the Fenian activity at the time, and where most of the plans for the rebellion were hatched in 1866 and 67, was Hoey's on the corner of Bridgeford Street and Bonham Street. But informers and unwanted press attention made Hoey's a target for the British. That press attention included an event widely reported in the papers of the day, that on April 28, 1866, a Fenian named Richard Dowling met James Mara on Thomas Street and invited him down to Hoey's for a drink. Mara had taken the secret oath, the IRB oath, in an upstairs room at the pub some time earlier. They entered the grocery part of Hoey's and walked through into the bar. Waiting for them there was Patrick Kearney, who pulled out a revolver and began to fire at Mara. Mara made his escape through the public house door onto Bonham Street. Dowling began shooting, but was wounded in the thigh in the crossfire. Mara was a Dublin-born British soldier, a private in the 8th Regiment, and he was an informer. He'd suffered 3 gunshot wounds but survived. Initially, Dowling claimed that he was an innocent bystander, as you would in a pub, when he was being treated in the Richmond hospital, but he was later charged with attempted murder and sedition. Also charged with attempted murder of the informer was Kearney, but at a trial, the jury could not agree, and both were released. Other pubs in Dublin where rebellion was fermented at the time included Fitzpatrick's, no longer there, on the corner of Georgia Street and Dame Street. A barman named John Hollowed. He was an active Fenian. In the aftermath, Hollowed escaped to America and became a well-known publican in Chicago. And this is one of the glass bottles he was produced for his pub on Adams Street in Chicago. What is today the Long Hall in Georgia Street, it was bought at the time by a senior Fenian, Joseph Cromian, in 1864. But he was arrested for promoting sedition. And he was arrested on February 17, 1866. And the courts ordered that part of his punishment was that the pub was to be closed permanently. It was sold a year later. Perhaps one of the most famous pubs attached to that period is Pilsworth's pub on James's Street. The blue building on the corner where the Lewis goes down is where it was. It was raided on March 1st, 1866, and 18 men, including many Irish-born serving members of the British Army, were arrested in a back room plotting rebellion. By March, following the arrest of John Devoy, the Fenian leader, in Pilsworth's pub earlier on February 22nd, some of the Irishmen who had been serving in the British Army, who were leaning towards becoming active in the rebel cause, changed their minds and began to inform on fellow soldiers as the prospects of mass executions loomed on the horizon. The writer R.V. Comerford described the Fenians as a voluntary social movement posing as a military organisation. Historian Richard English described the Fenians by saying they were drilling and marching, representing a kind of social activity, meeting in pubs, even more so. He also wrote that public houses were the centres of Fenians' socialisation and recruitment alike. Revolution was actually becoming a pastime. Much of the 1867 rebellion centred on the Tala area. This is from the Freeman's Journal on the 7th of March, 1867. At about 2 o'clock on Wednesday morning, commander of the forces, accompanied by a strong detachment of the 52nd Regiment and some squadrons from Portobello Barracks, proceeded through Crumlin in pursuit of Fenians in the direction of the Green Hills. The military captured 83 of the insurgents. A large number of men congregated last evening at Corbelis Constabulary Station and at Mr. Clark's public house at Jobstown, where they were as thick as they could stand. The then available leadership of the Provisional Government of the Irish Republic met in Clark's, the Jobstown Inn. Yet again, a Provisional Government of the Irish Republic had met in a pub. They met to assess the crumbling plans of the rebellion. This piece is from an eyewitness account, a remarkable autobiography, ever come across it, by a teleman called Malachy Horn. He wrote, "It was outside the Jobstown Inn that the men of this countryside banded themselves together for the Battle of Tala." Battle indeed. It wasn't even a fight. The Fenians took their stand before the Tala barracks, and they, without a plan, or a leader, or a hope of either. Another one of the famous revolutionary groups, of course, were the breakaway from the IRB, the Invincibles, who used a large network of public houses to conduct their business. One of their leaders, pictured here, was James Mullet, a publican, who was eventually to be charged and convicted for his part in the Burke and Cavendish assassination in the Phoenix Park. Sometimes, unfortunately, these meetings ended with fatal consequences. On March 25, 1882, Joseph Mann, Thomas Martin, and John Brennan entered Dunlap's bar on Dorset Street. That today now is the Eccles, in the corner of Dorset Street and Eccles Street. They went in just after midday and ordered 2 bottles and a pint of porter from the barmaid and adjourned to the pub snug. Moments later, a shot rang out and 22-year-old McMahon lay dying. 2 guns and bullets were found abandoned on the floor. Brennan ran out, according to him, to get assistance to take his friend to hospital. He was arrested by locals, including the pub's porter and a passing policeman. Martin was arrested nearby. The 2 men were charged with murder. The court heard the gun accidentally discharged, hitting McMahon in the chest. The men were found guilty of manslaughter in the case of Brennan after 2 trials and were sentenced to 12 months in prison. And they were released after 12 months. But it was revealed at a later trial that all 3 of them were members of the IRB and the Invincibles. And on the morning of that fatality in Dunlap's, the 3 of them had returned from a failed attempt to assassinate a leading British official. But lessons were to be learned. And the 1916 Rising was to be totally different. As Marcus said earlier, I conducted the 1916 tour, and one of my quotes on the tour was that because of the confusion in the orders at the start of the rebellion, the majority of the Irish volunteers failed to turn out. And as a result, the rebel leadership were unable to seize many of the key targets they had. So they weren't able to seize any British military barracks. I know they seized Lillian Hall and burned it because they weren't able to hold it. But they never seized any key military barracks, any sentry post, any outpost. But what they did manage to seize was 12 public houses, 3 distilleries and 2 breweries. Sounds like the perfect Irish rebellion. But in fact, every single one of them were seized for strategic reasons. According to volunteer Thomas Doyle of Enniscorthy, when that Wexford town was seized by the Irish volunteers, he said there was an order given that no publicans were to supply anyone with drink that evening. 2 men were caught drinking in Loftus Porter's public house in Temple Shannon. Mike Murphy and Bernard Neal were arrested, and the keys of the public house was taken from the owner. His shop was locked up and the keys brought to the headquarters. In 1916, lessons were being learned and drinking was frowned upon. Father Patrick Murphy in Enniscorthy had blessed the rebels prior to the seizure of the town. With the tricolour flying above the Athenaeum, he recalled, during the 4 days of Republican rule, not a single person was under the influence of drink. One of the oldest signatories of the proclamation and one of the rising's architects was Tom Clark. He frowned upon the availability of alcohol inside the GPO once the rising had begun. According to Come on the Mon member Catherine Bourne in her witness statement, on reaching the kitchen, I noticed a sort of bar where beer and minerals were kept. Tom Clark asked me, did I know anything about this business, meaning the bar business? I said, no, sir. He said, the reason I ask you is that I want you to destroy all this stuff, pointing to the beer. He tipped the neck of one of the bottles on the edge of the sink and poured it down. The volunteer and myself in the kitchen started to do the same, and Tom Clark went away. We were working hard at this job when Joe Gahan appeared and asked us what the hell we were doing that for. I said, orders. We had to put a sup of beer into a cup for Joe, who was fond of a drop. He stood in the corner, drinking it, telling me to stand watch for Tom Clark in case he would appear again. One of the group of rebels emptying the stout down the sink was future leader of the Irish forces during the War of Independence, Michael Collins. Somebody passed a remark to the effect that it was a shame to be wasting such precious liquor. Collins replied, if we lost in 98 through drink, we're not going to lose it through it this time. One of my favourite stories of the 1916 Rising is when the looting began after Pearse had read his proclamation and the police had disappeared off the street. The looting began in and around O'Connell Street, and Pearse dispatched 2 rebels to try and stop the looting. And they were returning towards the GPO when they heard a bit of noise from Madigan's pub on North Earl Street. Had a quick look in, saw nobody, so they came back out, and they were actually having a smoke outside when they heard noise again. So they went back in, and they looked down into the trapdoor into the cellar was behind the counter. And there at the bottom of the steps was 4 women, shawlies, sitting at what they described as a foot of wine, drinking it with saucers, drunk out of their heads, singing and roaring. And Rebel shouted down, "In the name of the new Irish Republic, you need to stop and leave the premises." At which moment a barrage of empty bottles came up the stairs, so the 2 men left and went back to the GPO and reported to Collins, who admonished them for not carrying out his orders to stop the looting. To which Joe Good replied, "Sir, I'd rather fight the British all day than any one of those shawlies." Now, of course, Barmen, because of our unsociable hours, were not able to attend the normal regular meetings of the volunteers, any trainings or drills. So what they did was they set up a grocer's company, which was based out in Fairview in Father Matthew Park. It had at one stage at the height 200 or 300 men, but following the split between the Irish Volunteers and the National Volunteers, it was reduced to about 45. Continued to drill. Of course, one of the men in charge was Paddy Moore, and I'll come to him shortly afterwards. Another story, another pub that I worked in was the Portobello. And when the rebels seized the Portobello, again, it was to stop the enemy coming out of the Rathmines barracks and trying to give the rebels in O'Connell Street a chance to reinforce their positions. The rebels under Sergeant Doyle was helped by a man called James Joyce, no relation of the original James Joyce. But he went in. J.T. Davy owned the pub at the time. He was Justice of the Peace, and Joyce worked there. But Joyce would go missing because he would go on manoeuvres up into the Dublin Mountains and he'd be missing his shifts, and J.T. Davy wasn't happy with this. So when Joyce appeared on Easter Monday, J.T. Davy told him that he had 5 minutes to gather his stuff and get out because he was sacked. Joyce fired a shot into the mirror behind the bar, beautiful mirror behind the bar, and told J.T. Davy that he had 1 minute to get out, that the pub was now under the control of the Irish Republic. Pub emptied, and the men set about reinforcing their position. And it was a beautiful, still is the same size front of the building. British forces came out of the barracks, came up as far as the bridge, came under fire from the rebels inside, and the British retreated and organised some reinforcements and some machine gun to be brought up onto the bridge, and for 3 solid hours opened fire in 3 lines of troops, and the first line lying down on the bridge, the other kneeling behind, another soldier standing behind, and then the machine gun on the bridge peppered the Portobello with gunfire. Not realising that for those full 3 hours, Joyce had organised that they'd use brushes and mop handles and anything they could find and put on J.T. Davies' coats and hats on them and put an odd rifle in the windows, and the British Army spent 3 hours firing at brushes and shovels at the windows. Rebels were long gone. They had escaped out the back. Probably the only time in history that the British Army were held up for 3 hours by a set of brushes. That's a picture there of Joyce. That's the picture was taken. They said it was mislabeled as being around 1916. It's actually nearer to 19. The pub was out being repaired at that stage. I did see a picture of the pub. It's in the hands of the Davy family. Picture taken after it, and it is absolutely peppered with bullets. And Humble Barman, again, was at the front of everything. Once the rebellion was over, there was a mass roundup, and in that mass roundup, many of them were barmen. And when the curfew was lifted and the martial law was lifted, there was no barman to open the pubs. And the Publicans Union, Publicans organisation, got in touch with the British, pleading with them to release some of these barmen. They had no barmen to open their pubs, and the British refused. So even though pubs were allowed to open once martial law was lifted, almost 30% of them couldn't. And they would later go on to suffer then. Some during when they came back, and it's those who had been in Frontline were released, the barmen came back. And by that stage, publicans had replaced them, and there was no jobs for them. So there was almost 3 nights of solid rioting, which started on Dorset Street, of barmen rioting against and as they'd say nowadays, bricking and breaking windows of the pubs in the area of Dorset Street, O'Connell Street, all the way up as far as the Quays. Went on for 3 nights. By the time the War of Independence came around, pubs were providing a vital cog in the battle against the enemy. The weapon and its use had been perfected, and the British had no answer to it. Now, my book cites many examples of the role of pubs during the War of Independence. Far too many to go in here, including the likes of the Buggery ambush in County Waterford in March 1921. Pubs like this, this is the one in Buggery, that's the pub. It was an ambush by the Black and Tans. Again, the pub was at the heart of it, both prior and after the attack, the pub being used as a hiding place. And then the British destroyed the pub, believing it was being used, but it hadn't. In fact, the publican was a real good loyalist at the time. But public houses throughout the War of Independence were heavily used. They became frontline. They were no longer safe to be in. They were being attacked. They were being destroyed. There was murders going on in the pubs. I'll come to a few of them. In the book, there is over 100 murders in pubs in the period of 1920 to 23 alone, and that's just fatalities. Hundreds more injured in pubs. The battle being fought around pubs and the perils of alcohol consumption is illustrated by the burning of Balbriggan by the Black and Tans in September 1920. The events of that night began in a pub on the evening of September 20th, when Head Constable Peter Burke and his brother Sergeant Michael Burke stopped off in Balbriggan on their way to Gormanston Camp. They had a drink in a public house with several Black and Tans. There was an altercation in the pub, and the local police were called to restore order. An IRA unit arrived and opened fire on them. Burke was shot dead by the IRA, and his brother was badly wounded, having been dragged into the road and being clubbed and kicked. At 11 p.m, the Black and Tans arrived from Gormanstown and began looting and burning the town. 2 local men, Sean Gibbons and Seamus Lawless, were arrested and beaten to death in the local police station. Balbriggan was just one of the towns, many towns, that were ransacked, with many pubs, publicans and their staff feeling the brunt of these events. In Balbriggan, 3 pubs alone were destroyed: Derham's, Smith's and McGowan's. Once again, because of the pub's proximity to Dublin Castle, the seat of British government, many officials used the Stag's Head to relax. But during the War of Independence, it found a different claim to fame. I use this, of course, because I work in the Stag's Head, and Michael Collins drank there. It's one of the places where his famous bottles of whiskey was kept. In the witness statements of Patrick Mullooly from Kiltruston in Strokestown in County Roscommon, a bartender at the Stag's Head, he also worked previously in the Dublin Metropolitan Police. He believed that he would be an asset to the Irish forces as a spy, to spy on those who were drinking in the pub, as many of them worked in Dublin Castle. In his words, this necessitated our mixing with the Tans and auxiliaries in the Stag's Head, a public house convenient to the castle. During our visits there, I saw not one civilian, apart from ourselves, calling there. Though we met O'Hara frequently, he would be given he would give no decided answer as to whether he would give information or not. And when we last took him downstairs to the lavatory, he seemed nervous and told us he could do nothing to help. The lavatories downstairs in the Stag's Head being used as an interrogation centre to get information coming out of Dublin Castle. And despite its location just 100 yards from Dublin Castle, Stag's Head was one of those pubs where you find Michael Collins with Crow Street just around the corner. Despite being the most wanted man in the island and a massive bounty on his head, he felt safe operating under the noses of the British and assisted by friendly bar staff. Mixed cask, as it was known. I just want to take a moment just to thank Michael at Kilmainham Tales. This is some of the artwork he has in the book, including Mullets again pub there. So it's he's done a really fantastic job, and I have to pay tribute to Michael at Kilmainham Tales for the work he done in Thirst for Freedom. Of course, Barmen, Frontline. This is Patrick Moran, executed on March 14th, 1921. He was born in Crossna in County Roscommon. He was the third of 11 children, went to primary school in Crossna before going to work as a grocer's assistant, which was what a barman was known at the time, in Boyle. In 1911, he moved to Dublin and began working at Lynch and O'Brien's pub in Dunleary before moving to McGee's in Blackrock. In that pub, McGee's pub today, if we're ever in Blackrock, it's now Conway's. He was an active member of the GAA and he was involved in the 1913 lockout. He was an adjutant of D Company's 2nd Battalion, the Dublin section of the Volunteers, and he would later go on to fight at Jacob's factory during the Easter Rising under Thomas MacDonagh. I forgot to mention Sean McDermott, of course. He was also executed after the Rising. He was a barman in Belfast. After the Rising, Moran was imprisoned in Knutsford Prison and later transferred to Frongoch. In 1917, he was a founder of the Irish National Union of Vintners, Grocers and Allied Trade Assistants, the Barmen's Union, for want of an easier way of putting it, now part of Mandate, going on to serve as the organisation's president and chairman of the Kingstown branch. He was arrested during 1920 during a 6-week barman strike at the time, agitating for more money. The paying conditions were very poor. And he was imprisoned in Mountjoy for 2 weeks when he refused to take bail, as he had said he had done nothing wrong. He was simply fighting for workers' rights. He had been arrested at his place of work and transferred to Harbour Hill. During Bloody Sunday, November 21st, 1920, Moran headed one of the IRA squads that killed 2 men at the Gresham Hotel on O'Connell Street. Leonard Wilde, a former British consul to Spain, and Patrick McCormack, a World War I veteran. He was arrested in the aftermath and was identified as the man who had held up a motorcyclist outside 38 Mount Street, where Lieutenant Amos had been killed. He was a suspected intelligence officer. Moran strongly protested his innocence of any involvement in that incident, which of course was true, because he had been involved in the Gresham Hotel incident. He claimed he was at Mass in Blackrock, over 4 miles away from the scene of the shooting in Mount Street. And at the time, several witnesses supporting his alibi went before the court, but it was false. Moran was convicted of murder and executed on March 14th, 1921. The Irish National Union of Vintners, Grocers and Allied Trade Assistants, of which Moran was the founder member, called a half-day strike on the morning of the executions, on the morning of Moran's execution. Some pubs ended up paying tax on the double. You'd think you complain today about paying tax once. At that time, they were paying tax on the double because they were paying tax both to the British and they were paying tax to the IRA. The IRA in certain places where the police, the RIC had abandoned stations and abandoned towns, the IRA attempted to police the laws, British laws, licensing laws in the town. A publican could be summoned to either a British court or an IRA court for illegal trading. Lawrence Flynn of Galway Volunteers stated in his witness statement, "I had my men on regular duty in every company area to ensure that public houses were not open for the sale of intoxicating liquor during prohibited hours. I remember one case of a publican being summoned for a breach of licensing laws. The publican in question was a Miss Furlong of Barrack Street, Loughrea, and she was summoned before the court for having men on her premises after closing hours. The case came before Mr. Corrie, Justice of the Parish Court. I applied to have the case dismissed as I learned that the men were caught on the premises playing a game of cards while waiting for an IRA battalion meeting. Case dismissed. One Tipperary publican complained to the Dublin GHQ that an IRA patrol had ordered him to close or face prosecution. But when the word that a British convoy was approaching, the IRA left and the British entered his premises and looted it with no protection from the IRA forces. Now, if you go to the book, you'll find a lot more about, I didn't get time to cover it in this, but Northern Ireland. Again, it had a different set of problems for the pubs up there. I'll show you a little bit of that now shortly. But again, killings took place in a lot of pubs in Belfast especially, but these were more of a sectarian nature. They had, especially during the period 1920 to 23, they weren't so much as British against Irish, it was loyalist against Catholic. One story is Armagh or Omagh in County Tyrone. Catholics at the time made up 3/5 of the population of the town, but the merchants and shopkeepers were at least 2-to-1 Protestant. Catholics almost, though, had a monopoly of the pubs in the town. There was one Protestant publican, a good Orangeman, but the good Orangeman was a notorious, a notorious thirsty species, deserted them, even on the 12th, as he had a name of selling bad drink. They instead frequented Catholic public houses, who saw Orangemen and their money the same as anybody else's cash. District Inspector Swansea. I know that was covered in another one of Testament of Tyrus lectures. Swansea, of course, was involved in the killing of Thomas McCurtain in Cork, and for his own safety, he was transferred to Lisburn. But the IRA caught up with him, and he was shot dead in August 1920 coming out of Mass in Lurgan. The Orangemen in the town rioted that night and destroyed the town, basically. But they focused on the public houses. In fact, all but 4 public houses in the town were destroyed in the rioting. This is a list of the pubs that went that night. Again, that was businesses gone, housing gone, jobs gone, and also that place where the social life of a town was, the public house. It was coming under real pressure. This is Ring in County Waterford. There's a picture of the pub there. That's courtesy of the Waterford Libraries. But again, pubs were being used as a place for identifying friend and foe alike. But alas, for many thirsty customers across the island of Ireland, the pursuit of a pint was filled with dangers. There were many violent deaths in the bars across the country. There are almost 100 in the period of 1920 to 1923 in the book. And while I'm not going to list them all here, I am going to pick out 1 or 2 just to try to show the dangers that was faced by publicans, bar staff, and of course customers alike. This is James Dunn in Ferns in Dunbar's pub, County Wexford, on July 5th, 1920. James Dunn was described as a miller from Gorey in County Wexford, and he was shot dead by an RIC constable, Harry Lenihan, a native of County Cork, at Dunbar's public house in Ferns. Constables Lenihan and Connell were in Dunbar's and they were drunk, in uniform. Thomas Dunbar, the owner, refused Connell any more drink, but he pushed Dunbar away and went behind the counter and grabbed a bottle of whiskey himself. Meanwhile, Dunn and Lenihan had become involved in a verbal argument. The bottle of whiskey dropped and smashed. O'Connell drew his weapon and fired into the ceiling and into the wooden floor, scattering the customers. Meanwhile, Lenihan used his gun to knock Dunn to the ground and pointed the gun at him and told him to plead for his life. Dunn refused, and when Lenihan heard his colleague's gunshots, he grabbed Dunn around the neck, pointed the revolver into his body and fired 2 shots, killing him. An inquest into Dunn's death returned a verdict of willful murder against the RIC constable. Constable Lenihan was charged with murder. At his trial, he was found not guilty of murder, but guilty of manslaughter, and sentenced to 7 years penal servitude. Burke's in James's Street, 174 James's Street. Mrs. Burke, the publican at the time, was the mother of the then president of the executive, William T. Cosgrove. Her pub also housed a grocery, and at 9:30 on Saturday night, September 30th, 1922, as her brother-in-law Patrick was closing the grocery part of the pub, 4 armed raiders entered and ordered him to put his hands up. One of the raiders went behind the counter and began to rob the till. Regarded still as a fit 65-year-old, Patrick attempted to grab one of the revolvers, and as the raiders hurriedly made their escape, 2 shots were fired. And when the barman arrived in from the public house section of Burke's, they found Patrick, the uncle of the head of the Irish state. He was dead on the floor. Burke's was a well-known pub. I think Enda Kenny unveiled a plaque outside it is now Kenny's on James's Street. A well-known publican in Belfast, Owen McMahon, was the owner of the Capstan Bar. As he made his way home from the pub, together with his Donegal-born bar manager, Edward McKinney, who was being provided lodgings at the family residence shortly after 1 a.m., a group of RIC officers, acting as a rogue vigilante force, entered the home. 7 men and boys were gathered in the living room, and the women locked in an upstairs bedroom. The RIC men gave the men moments to say their last prayers and opened fire at close range. Owen McMahon, aged 50, his sons Patrick, 24, or Frank, 24, Patrick, 22, Thomas, 15, and Edward McKinney, the bar manager, were all shot dead. 2 other sons were injured, having been left for dead. On November 14th, 1922, in Mullally's in Mulnahone in County Tipperary, this was shortly after the formation of the Irish Free State, 21-year-old, he turned out to be the first member of An Garda Síochána, at the time was the Civic Guard. Henry Phelan was shot dead in the pub, becoming the first member of the force to be killed on duty. Phelan was stationed in nearby Callan in County Tipperary and entered the pub with 2 colleagues, including Garda Thomas Flood, to collect some hurling equipment for his local club. When 3 men entered the pub and Phelan was shot dead. He was suspected that he was mistaken for his brother, who was a serving member of the RIC at the time. Local men Philip Leahy and James Daly were later charged in connection with the killing. Publicans too have lost their lives. Again, I'm kind of coming towards the end, so kind of going back to the beginning. This is again a picture of toners taking the Fistful of Dynamite, the film with James Corwin, was being filmed in the pub. Publicans too lost their lives throughout the War of Independence, including Larry Hickey. On March 10th, 1921, 5 masked and armed policemen raided Larry Hickey's on Main Street in Thurles when they found the owner in bed. He was ordered out in his night attire, and when he reached the head of the stairs, he was tripped and thrown down the stairs by an RIC man named Jackson. In the fall, Hickey's neck was broken. He was in great pain at the foot of the stairs. When Sergeant Enright, who was in charge of the raiders, shot him dead. He said afterwards it was to put an end to his misery. Hickey was well known in Thurles at the time as a Republican sympathiser. There are no statues, commemorations, or dedicated days to these publicans and their staffs who, without fear for their own personal safety and putting their livelihoods on the line, found themselves on the front line of battle. There was no template, guidelines, or protocols to follow for their remarkable contribution. No plaques to mark the spot where a barman or publican perished. No plaques to mark where wanton destruction destroyed a family business. No plaques to commemorate the pubs that provided a safe haven, weapon storage, funding, information, or acted as recruitment offices. their sacrifices should be recognised and applauded. These are some of the sites of pub fatalities between 1920 and 1923. Of course, the pub would be an empty vessel were it not for suppliers, the breweries and distilleries who kept the show on the road through production and delivery and providing employment. They too became unintentional battlefields. The pub, as I have demonstrated in this book, Thirst for Freedom, purchased by good friend Michael at Command Tales, has been a vital cog in the evolution and revolution of Irish self-determination. The Irish may have a reputation for their fondness for the pub, and that the Irish pub is a recognised emblem of a nation globally, but the pub has proved itself an invaluable resource in Ireland's fight to join the world of nations. As the 2020 pandemic painfully illustrated, the pub has once again found itself a hostage to fate. In 1918, as a result of the Spanish influenza that swept the world, almost 10% of bar staff in Ireland perished, as they were perceived as low-skilled and lower working class, therefore more susceptible to succumb to the pandemic. Yet, during that period, the pubs remained open, an escape from the terrors of disease and the aftermath of war. Throughout Irish history, the public house has proved itself resilient when it comes to death, as modern battles have been consumed with gangland violence. It has illustrated that the pub has once again found itself to be a soft target, whether it is for murder, violence, extortion, or theft. The pubs, publicans and their families and the staff have played a vital role in where we are today and as a nation, but it has come at the cost of property and lives, and I acknowledge that. Thank you.
Eddie, that was just fantastic. I have to say, the history of the Irish pub as well, even in terms of what I found reading your book, learning about Robert Emmet in the Brazen Head Hotel, the Brazen Head pub, which still is in existence.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, you're actually in a living piece of history in the actual building itself, and you're right about the plaques. The plaques should be there. You raise great points. We have a few questions I wouldn't mind asking from the audience, and again, if you have any more, guys, feel free to pop them in the Q&A and I'll ask them. So Paul Campbell had just given a comment. In 1826, the year that was mentioned earlier on, his dad Albert, who was age 87, told him his grandfather was alive and born the previous year in 1825. 200 years is not that long, perhaps equaling only 2 generations in this case. Mary Curran has a question for you. I'm in Manchester, England. Eva Gore Booth and her sister Constance Markovich campaigned here to allow barmaids to keep their jobs in the face of a campaign that argued they were in moral danger. And Eva and the barmaids won. Were any women involved in the pubs that you've studied, you know, from any of the stories? Or...
Surprisingly enough, there were a lot of publicans who were women. And again, you had the issue during the First World War, where many of the men had gone either to join the volunteers and to fight for Irish independence here, or had joined up to serve with the British Army on the Western Front. So women were left behind to run pubs, and often in some families where there'd be no son, the daughters would be helping out in the bars. Not so much in Dublin, but certainly down the country, a lot of women were involved in pubs. Not so much in the violent activities around the pubs, but they were running them, and you could see in several cases newspaper reports where if there was an event or maybe a coroner's court, it would be a female publican who would be interrogated as a witness.
Okay. Liam has mentioned about today being the 99th anniversary of the massacre of the McMahon family.
That's right, in Belfast.
Can you tell me just a little bit about that story? Like what was the background to that? Or
it was just an RIC gang that they were vigilantes. McMahon was well known as a sort of a Republican sympathiser. He ran a very good pub, the Capstan, in Belfast. But again, it was sectarian. It was nothing. It was just. I'm not saying it was wrong place, wrong time, but he would be singled out as a well-known and quite successful publican in Belfast at the time. It was a horrendous killing. It was a horrendous thing to do, to take them all down. And basically, they wanted to wipe out the entire family. Two of them survived, mainly because they were shot, and the RIC men who were there believed they were dead, when in fact they had survived.
Okay. David M has said it's great to hear of the Roscommon connection of Maluli and Moran, connections also to the Scramog ambush 100 years ago yesterday. I think Patrick Maluli was shot in reprisal for the ambush.
That's right, that's true, yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Jeff has said, just want to say that was absolutely fantastic, and thank you. I wanted to just ask you, which I thought was interesting, despite pubs being so prevalent, I remember reading that both Sean Moylan and Tom Barry have mentioned that the kind of men they wanted to recruit were those who didn't drink so much, because there'd be a danger with like loose lips, you know.
Again, they had learned their mistakes from failures of 1798 right through to 1867. They had learned that, you know, drink was the issue.
Yeah.
And like there had been an order out in 1916 by Pierce that it was punishable by death within the Irish Volunteers that you were not to drink. And there are many instances mentioned in the book, especially in the ship in Abbey Street, where they attacked the ship pub in Abbey Street, and like the way the publican thought of getting around them was to offer them free drink and get them drunk and be able to toss them out, but they didn't. They stayed clear of drink. They had learned their lesson, and then again, Collins, when it came to his time, he understood that some of the men needed a drink to steady the nerves, but again, it was, you know, they were on a mission. This was a cause. This wasn't you know, revolution as a pastime. This was revolution.
Yeah, and it's a great point you make, because I think they not only just learned their lesson, they actually got better in the sense of, I remember with Bloody Sunday, you had like Frank Thornton and Liam Tobin frequenting places where auxiliaries were before Bloody Sunday in terms of getting information. So they're actually turning the screws on them.
It's using the pub as a military weapon. It was a weapon, you know. It was a weapon that the British didn't use. You know, I mean, I could have told a story about Shanahan's and Ryan's and Ryan and all that, but you know, again, it's in the book. But I wanted to try to give a flavour of, I mean, that period which I had initially. The book was initially about just that period of 1916 to start the War of Independence, but then I wanted to know how it came to that point. So I went back to the research of the area rebellions and how our relationship with alcohol and how we had learned from our mistakes, especially the likes of the Collins and leadership. You know, they weren't teetotalers, but they used the pub in a far more clandestine way than just you know talking revolution.
Absolutely, and it's a great point that you actually call it a weapon, because even like doing like the Ashtown attack, I did a documentary on the Ashtown attack on Lord French, and you know, it talks about members of the squad and they're in there and they're drinking like maybe like a soft drink, you know, and
They were in Kelly's.
Yeah, they were all inconspicuous, and it's a great point you make though. You're right, everywhere the pub was kind of centre, and it nearly gets overlooked unfairly. Jack Britton has said, great lecture, thank you Eddie. Have you any info on the shooting dead of Captain Hugh Britton, IRA, and volunteer James Gallagher in Donegal town by a British Army deserter 1922?
No, I don't.
Problem.
Good question now, but worth looking up. I don't.
I think Liam Sullivan's going to answer that question for you, Jack. Mary Karan, thanks for your answer, Eddie. A great talk, and I'll be ordering your book. And the book is fantastic. Like, I'm not joking you now. This is a good book that looks at not only like Irish history that's overlooked, but even just a love of the Irish pub, especially in the past year that we've all had. Like, I desperately have been missing the crack in my local pubs, and I'm sure you have too. And it's great to actually read about it. And I hope the lecture tonight has been interesting in that sense. Mary Ann Mayer has said, fascinating lecture tonight, thank you. I carried out a bit of research on a local lady here in Ballingarry, Tipperary, who was an active member of B Company, 7th Battalion, 3rd Tipperary Brigade of Cumann from 1st April 1920 until 30th of June 1922, leaving due to ill health. She supplied refreshments on various dates and at all times of the night for IRA members in her parents' pub, which she was running, which was very rural but never made any claim for payment and kept no accounts. And in her interview records in the Bureau of Military Archives, during her appeal for pension, she notes the devastating effect her involvement in the War of Independence had on her family's pub that was raided on countless occasions. She spent from 1940 to 1958 trying to claim for pension. She was informed on the 15th November 1958 that she would receive a pension of £6.05. She died on the 7th of April 1960. Oh, that's tragic. I'm sure there are very many similar stories across Ireland. Deirdre Colgan has said, not a question, but a fantastic talk. Need to do a pub crawl. 100% Deirdre, I am with you. And if Eddie's going to have that pub crawl, I'll tell you, you'll have quite the posse behind you. And we'll even, you know, have our own rebellion by the end of it, I'm sure.
Solve the problems of the world.
Yeah, you name a problem, we'll sort it out that night. May Moran, great insight into the role the pub played in the struggle for independence. Glad to hear mention of my uncle Paddy Moran, executed 100 years ago. And Mary Moran has given a fantastic lecture on Paddy Moran before.
A great book as well she wrote.
Yeah, it's a fantastic book on March 14th. And it's great to see the recognition of his contribution to the labour movement. Great lecture, Eddie. Margaret Furlong, thank you so much. Brilliant lecture. Dermot O'Donoghue, would the ambush at Bain-la-Blah have taken place if the IRA meeting was in the pub that morning? That's an interesting question. Eddie, do you want to answer that first, or?
Again, you have to remember that some of the scouts were out drinking in the pub when they realised it was happening. You know.
Yeah, I know for a fact that they said it was a date rather than a time that they were to meet up the anti-treaty behind in Long's pub, because they're all on the run.
Yeah.
So, but it was out the back of the pub. I think they had to keep them kind of focused as well. So Deirdre Colgan said Yahoo, she can't wait as well. Eddie, I just want to say, like, I mean, that was fantastic. Even if it was of James Mullet of the Invincibles, I mean.
Yeah, I only came across that a couple of weeks ago, and the pubs that were used, and like it was in the Windsor magazine. I'd probably not up online that long, and it's a real old magazine, but it's a great piece on the Invincibles. Really, it's an old article. It was written, but it has fantastic photographs and fantastic stories in it. I was fascinated by it. I read it from start to finish. I was fascinated by it.
Well, I think that you have helped people rediscover the Irish pub maybe in a different sense. Can I ask, just before we go, what influenced you to write the book?
A love of history. It was just a combination of my two. It was the love of history. When I realised how many barmen were involved in, how many barmen were actually arrested in the aftermath of 1916, I wanted that to be recognised. There was a huge, disproportionately, the amount of barmen, because the British believed, going on past experience, that the rebellion was planned in pubs and that barmen would know what was going on. Now, the barmen did, but not to the extent of the arrests that went on. Huge amount of barmen were arrested and sent across to Francoch and England and Wales. It was that part of it. I just felt that it was a part of history was neglected. And I know we have this love of alcohol and we love our pubs, and you know, and I love my business. I'm in the business. My father was in the business for 67 years before he passed away. And I'm sure probably people will recognise the name Bohan, we're well known in the bar trade. But again, it's my love of history and the fact that I just believe that it was a unique. You know, if you look at other revolutions or whatever, or wars, it was a unique weapon, the pub, of how we used it and how we learned to use it and how we learned almost a respect for the alcohol itself. But it was the premises and the people who worked in it that were key to, you know, unlocking the battle for War of Independence.
Okay. Well, I'd like to thank you, Eddie, for this talk tonight, and I hope we'll all come to visit you in the pub at some stage soon. And thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. Please do get Eddie's book. It is a great read, available at kilmainhamtales.ie, €15 postage.
And there's signed copies.
And there's signed copies as well. So you should charge extra for that, Eddie. Listen, thanks a million, everybody, and we'll see you again. Take care, Eddie. Thanks again.
Really no problem. Thank you.
Pleasure.